We've just got some breaking news in from Buckingham Palace, folks, and it relates to Prince Andrew.
Just 1 minute ago, Buckingham Palace released a statement that sent shockwaves around the world. During routine renovations, workers discovered something behind the walls that should never have been there. At first, they thought it was nothing. Then they looked closer. Their hands trembled as they realized what they were seeing. Palace officials rushed to the scene. Security cleared the area immediately. "Nobody can know about this," one insider revealed, but secrets this big never stay hidden forever. The walls held evidence of a royal scandal so explosive it threatens to rewrite centuries of history. What exactly did they uncover? The architect who heard the palace breathe. Sir Aldrich Rowan was not the kind of man who rushed through life. At 53, he had learned that old buildings spoke only to those who listened, and he had made a career out of patience. His colleagues often teased him for spending 20 minutes staring at a wall before making a single mark, but Aldrich believed that stone and wood held memories that deserved respect. On the third week of his assignment, while examining a section of the eastern corridor, Aldrich noticed something that made him pause mid-step. The morning light was filtering through tall windows, casting long shadows across the ornate wallpaper, and there it was, a crack, thin as a hair, running vertical behind an elaborate wooden panel that records showed had been installed in 1847 and never moved since. Most people would have walked past it without a second glance, but Aldrich was not most people. He set down his leather satchel and approached the wall slowly, as if afraid sudden movement might make it disappear. The crack was barely visible, hidden in the shadow where the panel met the plasterwork, but once he saw it, he could not look away. He ran his fingers along the edge, feeling the slight separation between wood and wall. The temperature seemed different there, cooler. He stepped back and tilted his head, studying the panel from various angles. His notebook came out, and he began sketching the location, the measurements, the way the light hit the crack at different times of day. "Something wrong, Sir Rowan?" one of the younger engineers asked, passing by with a clipboard. Aldrich shook his head slowly. "I am not certain yet, but something feels odd about this wall." The next morning, he returned with his tools. The palace was quiet at that early hour, with only security personnel and a few staff members moving through distant corridors. Aldrich preferred working in silence. It helped him think. He took a small wooden mallet from his bag, the kind that made almost no sound, and began tapping gently along the panel. At first, the sound was exactly what he expected, the solid thunk of wood against plaster and brick. But as he moved higher, past where the crack began, everything changed. The sound became hollow, empty, as if there was nothing behind the wall at all. Aldrich froze. His heart, usually so steady, began to beat faster. He tapped again, listening carefully. The hollow echo rang out clearly now that he knew what to listen for. He moved along the panel, tapping every few inches, mapping out in his mind the shape and size of whatever space existed behind the royal wall. It was not small. There was not a gap left by settling or construction error. This was deliberate. This was a room. He called the chief engineer, a practical woman named Margaret who had worked on palace projects for 15 years. She arrived within the hour, clearly skeptical until Aldrich showed her what he had found. She tapped the wall herself, listened to the echo, and her expression changed from doubt to confusion. "That should not be there," she said quietly. "I know." Records show this wing was completely documented during the renovations in the 1850s and again in the 1920s. There is no mention of any sealed chambers. "I know," Aldrich repeated. They looked at each other, and without another word, both understood what came next. They wanted to look inside. It took 3 days to get the proper permissions. The palace was not a place where you simply knocked down walls on a whim. Protocols had to be followed, historians consulted, security briefed. But eventually, on a gray Thursday afternoon, Aldrich stood before the panel with a small crowbar in hand, and a team of specialists gathered behind him. He felt the weight of their anticipation pressing against his shoulders. He inserted the crowbar carefully into the crack and applied gentle pressure. The old wood resisted at first, groaning like an ancient door that preferred to stay shut. Then, with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet corridor, the panel shifted. A gap appeared, and from that gap came air, cold air, stale air that tasted of dust and time and things long forgotten. Aldrich pulled harder. The panel swung away, hinges that had not moved in over a century screaming in protest. Darkness yawned before them, absolute and deep. He reached for his torch, switched it on, and pointed the beam into the opening. The light revealed stone steps leading down into shadow, old steps, steps that had not felt footsteps in generations. The beam caught edges of walls, the suggestion of a corridor below, but nothing more. The darkness seemed to swallow the light after only a few feet. Nobody spoke. Margaret stepped closer, peering over Aldrich's shoulder. One of the historians made a small sound in his throat, something between surprise and excitement. A security officer spoke into his radio, his voice low and urgent. But Aldrich could only stare into that hidden darkness, his gentle heart pounding, his careful mind racing. He had restored countless buildings, uncovered forgotten cellars and bricked up windows, but this felt different. This felt like something that had been hidden on purpose, something that someone long ago had decided the world should not find. His hand gripped the torch tighter. The cold air continued to flow out, carrying with it the scent of secrets that had waited patiently in the dark, waiting for someone like him, someone patient enough to notice a crack, someone careful enough to listen when the palace began to breathe. What lay below those steps he could not yet know. But standing at the threshold of that hidden space, Sir Aldrich Rowan understood one thing with absolute certainty. Buckingham Palace had just stopped keeping a very old secret. The woman who walked into forgotten silence. Inspector Elise Harland was the kind of person who noticed everything twice, once with her eyes and once with her gut. She had worked palace security for 11 years, and in that time she had learned that the most dangerous situations were not the loud ones. They were the quiet ones. The moments when something felt just slightly wrong, like a painting hung 1 inch too low or a door that should have been locked but was not. She trusted those feelings more than she trusted reports or reassurances. When the call came about the hidden chamber behind the eastern corridor wall, Elise was in her office reviewing incident reports from the previous week. She set down her pen, pulled on her jacket, and walked toward the discovery without hurrying. Whatever was waiting had already waited a very long time. The architect who had found it was still there when she arrived, Sir Aldrich Rowan. She had met him briefly during the security briefing for the restoration project. He seemed like a thoughtful man, the type who cared more about protecting history than making headlines. Now he stood near the opening in the wall, his face pale but composed, speaking quietly with the chief engineer. When Elise approached, he turned and gave her a small nod. "Inspector Harland, thank you for coming." "Tell me what you found," she said simply. He explained about the crack, the hollow sound, the cold air. As he spoke, Elise studied the opening. The darkness beyond seemed thick, almost solid. She could feel the temperature difference from where she stood. Cold air continued to drift out, carrying with it a smell that reminded her of old libraries and closed attics, the smell of time passing without witnesses. "Has anyone gone down yet?" she asked. "No, we were waiting for you." Elise appreciated that. She stepped closer to the opening and shone her torch down the stone steps. The beam caught rough walls, narrow and steep, leading into shadow. This was not part of the palace tours. This was not something visitors were ever meant to see. She turned to the security officer standing nearby. "Seal this corridor. No one enters without my clearance. Get me a structural engineer and someone from the Royal Archives." Then she looked at Sir Aldrich. "I need you with me. You know buildings. I need to know if what we are walking into is safe." He nodded, picking up his leather satchel. "I will do my best." "That is all anyone can do," Elise said, and together they descended into the hidden passage. The steps were older than she had expected, medieval perhaps. The stone was worn smooth in the center where countless feet had once traveled, but the edges were sharp, untouched by time. Someone had walked this path often, long ago. At the bottom, the passage opened into a corridor barely wide enough for two people to stand side by side. The walls were brick, and the air tasted stale. Elise moved her torch slowly along the walls, studying every detail. The corridor stretched ahead for perhaps 20 meters before ending abruptly. As they walked closer, she realized why it ended. Someone had bricked it up, but not carefully. Not with the precision and craft that marked the rest of the palace. This wall had been built in a hurry, the mortar sloppy, the bricks uneven. "This was sealed quickly," Sir Aldrich said quietly beside her. "Look at the pattern. They were not concerned with making it beautiful. They wanted it closed." "When?" Elise asked. He studied it for a long moment, running his fingers along the brickwork. "Judging by the materials and method, I would guess the late Victorian era, perhaps 1870s or 80s, but I cannot be certain without proper analysis." Elise made notes in her phone, photographing everything. Someone had ordered this corridor erased from existence. Someone with authority. Someone who wanted whatever lay beyond that brick wall to be forgotten. She stepped back, searching the edges of the sealed passage for any indication of what it had been. And then she saw it. To the left of the brick wall, partially hidden in shadow, was a door. A wooden door, dark with age, set flush against the stone. But it was unlike any palace door she had ever seen. There was no handle, no keyhole, no lock mechanism of any kind, just smooth wood and a frame that fit so tightly there was barely a gap. "That makes no sense," Sir Aldrich whispered. Elise approached it slowly. She ran her hands along the surface, feeling for any hidden mechanism, any way it might open. The wood was cold and solid under her fingers, and then she noticed something else. Marks on the wood. Carvings. Faint and worn, almost invisible in the torchlight, but definitely there. She brought her face close, angling the light carefully. They were symbols, not letters, not numbers. Strange, angular marks that seemed to follow some pattern she could not understand. They covered the entire surface of the door, layered over each other as if multiple people had carved them at different times. Some were deep, deliberate. Others were scratched hastily, desperately. "What language is that?" Sir Aldrich asked, leaning in beside her. "I do not know," Elise said honestly. She pulled out her phone and began taking detailed photographs of every symbol, every mark, every scratch. The pattern seemed almost random, but she had learned long ago that nothing was truly random. Everything meant something to someone. She sent the photographs immediately to 3 different experts: a professor of ancient languages at Cambridge, a historian who specialized in royal iconography, a cryptographer she had worked with on a case 2 years prior. Then she stepped back and stared at the door, trying to understand what she was seeing. A door with no lock, symbols that made no sense, a corridor sealed in panic and left to be forgotten. "Who locks a door without using a lock?" she said aloud, though she was asking herself. Sir Aldrich had no answer. Neither did the security officer who had followed them down. The 3 of them stood in that narrow, forgotten corridor, surrounded by cold air and silence that felt almost alive. Elise had investigated threats to the palace before. Suspicious packages, trespassers, even an attempted break-in 3 years ago. But those were simple problems with simple solutions. This felt different. This felt like walking into a question that had no right answer. Her phone buzzed. The Cambridge professor had responded already. The message was short. "I have never seen these symbols before. They do not match any known alphabet or historical writing system I can identify. Where did you find this?" Elise read the message twice, then looked back at the door. Whatever those symbols meant, they had been important enough to carve into wood, important enough to hide behind brick walls and sealed corridors, important enough that someone, generations ago, had decided the world should never find them. She stood there in the darkness beneath Buckingham Palace, her steady heart finally beginning to beat faster. Not from fear, but from the cold certainty that she had just walked into something far larger than a forgotten room. This was a secret that someone had tried very hard to bury, and now, after all these years of silence, it was beginning to speak. The historian who found a queen that never was. Dr. Lionel Havers had spent 42 years reading about the dead, and in that time he had learned that history was not a collection of facts, but a series of choices about what to remember and what to forget. He was 67 years old with silver hair that fell across his forehead when he leaned too long over ancient manuscripts, and spectacles that sat crooked on his nose because he was always forgetting to adjust them. When Inspector Harlan called him about the sealed chamber, Lionel had been in the middle of grading essays. He listened to her description of the symbols on the door, asked her to send the photographs immediately, and stared at his computer screen for 10 full minutes without moving. His hands had begun to shake, not from fear, but from excitement mixed with something darker, recognition. He had seen fragments of those symbols before, decades ago, in a manuscript that had later disappeared from the royal archives, a manuscript he had been told to forget about. He arrived at the palace within the hour carrying a worn leather briefcase that had belonged to his father and breathing hard from climbing the stairs too quickly. Inspector Harlan met him at the corridor entrance, her expression serious but calm. She led him through the security checkpoint, down the stone steps, and into the hidden passage. With each step deeper into the forgotten space, Lionel felt his heart beating harder. This was what he had spent his entire life searching for without quite knowing it. The gaps in history, the silences that spoke louder than words. When he saw the door with his own eyes, he stopped walking. His breath caught in his throat. The symbols were clearer in person, more deliberate than the photographs had suggested. He approached slowly, reaching out with trembling fingers to trace the carvings. "Do you recognize them?" Inspector Harlan asked quietly. "I have seen pieces of this before," Lionel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Years ago, in a document that was removed from circulation. I was told it was a forgery, that I should not waste time on it, but I never forgot." "What did the document say?" Lionel shook his head. "I only saw 3 pages before it was taken, but there were drawings, symbols like these, and references to something called the unmarked chamber." They looked at each other, and in that moment both understood they were standing at the threshold of something that had been deliberately erased. Inspector Harlan turned to the security team and gave a sharp nod. 2 officers stepped forward with tools designed to force open doors without destroying them. It took 20 careful minutes. The wood was old but strong, and whatever mechanism held it closed had been built to last. But finally, with a sound like an exhale, the door swung inward. Cold air rushed out, colder than the passage, colder than anything Lionel had felt inside a building. He stepped through first, unable to help himself, and found himself standing in a circular room that should not exist. Not here, not beneath the palace, not anywhere in the official records of British architecture. The ceiling was low and domed, made of stone that looked far older than the palace above. The walls were lined with tapestries, faded and moth-eaten, but still showing fragments of images, trees, stars, figures in robes. Along the edges of the room sat wooden chests, their surfaces covered in dust so thick it looked like gray snow. Broken lanterns hung from iron hooks, their glass shattered, their wicks long cold. Everything in the room felt frozen in time, as if someone had walked out one day and simply never returned. Inspector Harlan moved carefully around the perimeter, photographing everything, while Sir Aldrich examined the structural integrity of the walls. But Lionel walked straight to the center of the room where a small wooden table stood alone. On that table, catching the beam of his torch, was a leather-bound ledger. His hands shook as he picked it up. The leather was cracked with age, the binding loose, but it held together when he carefully opened the cover. No title, no author. Just pages filled with elegant handwriting that grew increasingly frantic as he turned each leaf. The dates ranged from 1876 to 1881. The entries were written in English, but the language was coded, careful, as if the writer feared being discovered. Lionel read aloud, his voice echoing in the circular chamber. 16th of April, 1878. The council has decided. She cannot be acknowledged. The risk is too great, the scandal too deep. Her very existence threatens what has been so carefully built. We have agreed. She will be kept. She will be forgotten. And when time has done its work, no one will know to ask if she was real. Inspector Harlan stepped closer. Who are they talking about? Lionel turned the pages, scanning desperately for names, for any concrete detail. But the ledger was written to obscure, not to reveal. It spoke of a woman with a claim, a woman who had been hidden away for reasons the writer never stated directly. Page after page described decisions being made in secret, documents being destroyed, servants being paid to remain silent. It was a record of an erasure, a deliberate removal of someone from history itself. "There is nothing about this in any archive," Lionel said, looking up at Inspector Harland. His face had gone pale. "I have read every royal record from this period, every letter, every diary entry that survived. There is no mention of any woman being hidden, no unexplained disappearance, nothing." "Then why does this exist?" she asked. Lionel had no answer. He closed the ledger carefully, holding it as if it might dissolve in his hands, and turned to survey the rest of the room. That was when he saw the portrait. It hung on the far wall, partially hidden behind one of the old tapestries. He walked toward it slowly, pulling the fabric aside to reveal the full image. The portrait showed a woman in her late 20s or early 30s, wearing a dress from the Victorian era, deep emerald green with black lace. Her hair was dark and pulled back severely, emphasizing the sharp angles of her face, but it was her eyes that made Lionel stop breathing. They were painted with such skill that they seemed to follow him. Intelligent eyes, angry eyes, eyes that had seen something terrible and never forgotten. There was no nameplate, no signature from the artist, nothing to indicate who she was or why her portrait hung in a sealed room beneath Buckingham Palace. Inspector Harland stood beside him, staring up at the painting. "She is not in any royal registry I have ever seen." "No," Lionel agreed quietly. "She is not." They stood together in that forgotten chamber, surrounded by dust and silence and secrets that had waited over a century to be found. The woman in the portrait stared down at them with those fierce, knowing eyes. Around them, the broken lanterns swayed slightly in the cold air, though there was no breeze. The tapestries whispered against the stone, and in Lionel's hands, the ledger felt suddenly heavier, as if the weight of all those erased years was pressing down on his fingers. He looked back up at the portrait, meeting those painted eyes, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature, because he suddenly understood something that made his academic mind rebel even as his instincts screamed that it was true. This woman had been real, she had lived, she had been important enough to hide, and someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make certain she disappeared. "Who were you?" he whispered to the portrait. But the more pressing question, the one that made Inspector Harland reach for her phone and Dr. Havers grip the ledger tighter, was something else entirely. If this woman had been dangerous enough to erase from every record, powerful enough to require a hidden chamber and coded warnings, important enough that her very existence threatened the crown itself, then why had someone painted her portrait and left it here where it might someday be found? Was it a warning, a confession, or something far more dangerous, evidence that whatever secret she represented was not quite as buried as someone had hoped? The princess who refused to disappear. Princess Eleanor had always been different from the moment she drew her first breath in the summer of 1851. While other royal children learned to curtsy and smile on command, Eleanor learned to question. She was the type of child who noticed when servants looked tired and asked why they worked such long hours. As she grew older, that compass only became stronger. Eleanor was small in stature but enormous in presence. She had dark curls that refused to stay pinned properly, eyes that sparkled when she spoke about things she cared about, and a smile that could light up entire rooms. Palace staff adored her because she remembered their names, asked about their families, and treated them like human beings rather than furniture. She would sneak food from banquets to give to hungry people she met on her rare trips outside the palace walls. She read every book she could find, especially the ones her father said were unsuitable for women. By the time she turned 20, Eleanor had become someone the crown did not know how to handle. Dr. Lionel Havers felt like he was falling in love with a ghost as he uncovered her story. Every document he found made her more real, more alive, more heartbreakingly human. The first concrete evidence came from a storage room in the palace basement, where he found a wooden box labeled simply EVM Personal Effects. Inside were ribbons from childhood, a pressed flower, a small diary with entries about visiting an orphanage, and a sketch Eleanor had drawn of a little girl playing in the street. At the bottom was a birth record, official and undeniable, listing Eleanor Victoria Margaret as the king's third child. But when Lionel checked every official family tree, every published history, every royal genealogy, Eleanor's name was nowhere. She had been surgically removed from her own bloodline. He found photographs of the royal family where someone had been carefully cut out, leaving awkward, empty spaces. He found mentions of the king's 3 children in early documents that were later changed to the king's 2 children in handwritten corrections. Someone had spent years going through records, erasing Eleanor from existence 1 page at a time. "Why would they do this?" Inspector Harland asked when Lionel showed her what he had found. "Because she became dangerous," Lionel said quietly, holding up a bundle of letters. The letters revealed everything. Eleanor had not simply disagreed with her family about small matters. She had challenged the entire foundation of their power. In one letter to a trusted friend, she wrote words that must have terrified the crown. "How can we call ourselves a Christian nation when children die in mines to make wealthy men richer? How can we speak of justice when laws are written only to protect those who need no protection? I no longer believe that royal blood makes anyone superior. I believe it makes us responsible." She had gone further than just writing letters. Palace records showed Eleanor attending reform meetings, sometimes in disguise. She donated her own money to workers' organizations. She wrote articles for progressive newspapers under a false name, arguing that Parliament should have more power than the monarch. One particularly damning report described her speaking to a group of suffragettes about women's rights and the need for fundamental change in how the country was governed. Her father had been horrified. One advisor's letter described the king as apoplectic with rage that his own daughter would betray her class and position. They tried everything to stop her. They restricted her movements, monitored her correspondence, forbade her from attending any public events. But Eleanor found ways around every restriction. She was brilliant and determined, and she would not be quiet about injustice simply because it was convenient for her family. The breaking point came in the summer of 1881. Eleanor gave a speech at a private gathering that was supposed to be secret, but palace spies were everywhere. She called the monarchy an outdated system that serves the few at the expense of the many. She said that all people, regardless of birth, deserve dignity and representation. She declared that she would rather give up her title than remain silent while people suffered. The king summoned her the next day. No record exists of what was said, but a chambermaid reported hearing shouting from behind closed doors. Eleanor emerged from that meeting with red eyes and clenched fists. She was confined to the East Wing, effectively imprisoned in her own home. For 3 months she remained there, allowed no visitors, her letters intercepted, her voice contained. Then came September 23, 1881, the night everything changed. The night that should have been Eleanor's end, but somehow became something else entirely. Lionel found fragments of what happened. Household records showed unusual orders. Guards moved to the East Corridor. Torches brought in. A doctor called at midnight but sent me away without entering. A servant's diary entry described sounds of struggle, voices raised, something heavy being dragged. The next morning, Eleanor was gone. Not dead, according to any record. Simply gone, as if she had never existed. But here was the mystery that kept Lionel awake at night. If the crown wanted Eleanor dead, they could have announced an illness, held a funeral, buried her quietly. Royal scandals were managed that way all the time. Instead, they had erased her completely. No death, no grave, no acknowledgement that she had ever lived. And then someone with access and resources and courage, had built this hidden chamber, had painted her portrait, had preserved the ledger documenting her erasure. Lionel stood in that circular room looking up at Eleanor's fierce painted eyes and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. Because suddenly he understood something that made his academic mind rebel even as his instincts screamed it was true. The crown had not executed Eleanor that night. They had done something worse. Something that mandated this hidden room and these secret records. Something that wanted to be documented by someone who knew the truth was too terrible to die with them. The question that haunted him now, the one that made Inspector Harland reach for her phone with shaking hands, was this. If Eleanor had not died in that corridor on that terrible September night, if her body was never buried and her death was never recorded, then what had they done with a princess who refused to disappear? The stone that held a confession. Sir Aldrich Rowan had always believed that buildings never lied. People lied. Documents could be forged. Memories faded and twisted with time. But stone and wood and brick told the truth if you knew how to listen. At 53, with tired eyes and patient hands, Aldrich had spent his entire career learning that language. Now, standing in the hidden chamber beneath Buckingham Palace, he felt the room speaking to him in ways he could not yet understand. After Dr. Havers shared his findings about Princess Eleanor, Aldrich returned to the circular chamber alone. He wanted silence to think, to see what others might have missed. Inspector Harland had given him permission to examine the space more thoroughly, trusting his instincts about old structures. The portrait of Eleanor watched him from the wall as he worked, her painted eyes following his movements. Aldrich began at the edges, working his way inward. He examined the tapestries, the walls, the wooden chests. Everything had been searched already, catalogued and photographed. But he was not looking for objects. He was looking for intention, for choices made by whoever had built this room. Why this shape? Why this location? Why preserve evidence of something that was supposed to be forgotten? Then he looked down at the floor. Stone tiles, worn smooth by age, fitted together in a pattern common to Victorian construction, except for one. Right at the center of the room, directly beneath where someone standing would naturally look up at Eleanor's portrait, one stone sat slightly higher than the others, just a fraction of an inch. Most people would never notice, but Aldrich noticed everything. He knelt carefully, his knees protesting, and ran his fingers along the edges of that stone. It was heavier than the others, cut from different material, darker, denser. He pressed down on one corner, and the opposite edge lifted slightly like a lever. His heart began to beat faster. "Inspector," he called quietly into his radio, "I need you down here." 20 minutes later, with proper tools and Inspector Harland standing beside him, Aldrich carefully pried up the stone. It was heavy, requiring both of them to lift it. Beneath was not earth or foundation, but a hollow space, a deliberate hiding place. And inside that space, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived over a century, were 3 rolled scrolls. Aldrich's hand shook as he lifted them out. The oilcloth cracked and fell away. The scrolls were bound with red ribbon, the kind used for official documents. But these bore no seals, no signatures on the outside, just dates written in fading ink. September 1881, October 1881, November 1881. Inspector Harland carefully unrolled the first scroll on the table they had brought down. The handwriting was rough, unpracticed, not the elegant script of nobility, but the careful letters of someone who had learned to write as an adult. It was a confession. "My name is Thomas Garrett," it began. "I served as a royal guard for 19 years. I write this because I cannot die with this sin unspoken. On the night of September 23, 1881, I was ordered by the King's private secretary to take Princess Eleanor from her chambers. She fought us. God forgive me, she fought like a lion, screaming about justice and the people. We were 6 guards against 1 small woman, and still she nearly escaped. We were told she was mad, dangerous, a threat to the crown. We were told we were protecting the realm. I believed it then. I do not believe it now." Aldrich looked up at Inspector Harland. Her face had gone pale. They unrolled the second scroll. Another confession from a guard named Peter Mills. His account matched Thomas's but added more details. Eleanor had been dragged to the sealed corridor, still conscious, still fighting. She had been held there while a physician examined her and declared her of sound mind, which had angered the secretary, who had clearly hoped for a different verdict. The third confession was the most damning. It came from the captain of the guard, a man named James Winthrop. His handwriting was steadier, more educated, and his words were brutal in their honesty. Princess Eleanor was not mad. She was not dangerous except to those who profit from injustice. She was taken because she spoke the truth that powerful men could not afford to have spoken. I was told she would be sent away quietly to a private estate where she could live in comfort but silence. I believed this lie. I helped load her into a carriage in the dark of night. She begged me to help her. She said she was fighting for people like my own children. I turned away. I followed orders. I have hated myself every day since. The confessions went on, each man trying to explain what had happened to the princess they had helped disappear. She had been taken to a remote location. Her identity had been erased. She had been held under false names, moved from place to place, kept alive but silenced. All because she had dared to challenge a system that benefited from inequality. Aldrich sat back, the weight of what they had found pressing down on his chest. Eleanor had not been executed. She had been erased from existence while still breathing, hidden away like an inconvenient object, her voice taken, her identity destroyed, all because she had cared too much about the wrong people. "Why leave these confessions?" Inspector Harland asked quietly. "Why build this chamber and hide the truth if they were part of silencing her?" Aldrich looked up at Eleanor's portrait, at those fierce, knowing eyes, and understood. "Guilt," he said simply. These men could not speak the truth while they lived, but they could not let it die with them either. This chamber is their confession, their attempt at redemption. But as they stood there in that hidden room, surrounded by evidence of a crime over a century old, one question burned brighter than all the others. The confessions told them Eleanor had been taken, moved, hidden, but they never said where. They never said what became of her. So after all these years of silence, after a lifetime of being erased and forgotten, where had Princess Eleanor been taken, and more terrifyingly, could any trace of what happened to her still exist somewhere, waiting like this chamber had waited, patient and dark and full of truths that powerful people had hoped would never see light? The truth that would not stay buried. Inspector Elise Harland had always understood that some truths were too heavy for one person to carry alone. She was practical by nature, careful with her words, and deeply aware that what she did in the next few hours would ripple far beyond herself. As she stood outside the private meeting room in Buckingham Palace, holding a folder containing copies of the confessions and photographs of Eleanor's hidden chamber, she felt the weight of history pressing against her shoulders. This was not just evidence of a crime. This was a story that had been violently silenced, and now it was demanding to be heard. She was not alone. Dr. Lionel Havers stood beside her, looking older than he had weeks ago, worn down by the emotional toll of uncovering Eleanor's fate. Sir Aldrich Rowan was there too, quiet and steady, the man whose careful attention had started all of this with a single crack in a wall. Together, they waited to face the people who had inherited the throne Eleanor had once challenged. When they were called inside, the room felt smaller than Elise had expected. 4 members of the current royal family sat before them, their faces carefully neutral. A private secretary stood in the corner, taking notes. No press, no advisors, just the people who would have to decide what to do with a secret their ancestors had buried. Elise presented the findings calmly and clearly. The hidden chamber, the portrait, the ledger, the confessions. Princess Eleanor, erased from history for demanding justice. She showed them photographs of the symbols on the door, the desperate handwriting in the guard's confessions, the birth certificate that proved Eleanor had existed despite every official record saying otherwise. She spoke without emotion, letting the facts tell their own story. The silence that followed was suffocating. One of the younger royals looked genuinely shaken, her hands gripping the armrest of her chair. An older member stared at the photographs with an expression Elise could not quite read. Finally, the most senior royal present spoke, her voice measured and cold. "This is deeply troubling, but it happened over a century ago. What purpose does exposing this serve now?" Lionel stepped forward, unable to stay silent. Eleanor fought for people who had no voice. She was punished for it by the very family meant to protect her. Her story matters. The truth matters. "The truth can also be destructive," the royal replied. "Think of what this could do to the institution, the questions it would raise, the damage to the crown's reputation." Elise felt anger rising in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "With respect, ma'am, the damage was done when Eleanor was taken from her home and erased from existence. We are simply asking that it finally be acknowledged." The room fell silent again. For 10 long minutes, the royals conferred in whispers. Elise stood straight, refusing to look away, refusing to let them forget that she was watching, that history was watching, that somewhere in the silence of over a century, Eleanor's voice still demanded to be heard. Finally, the decision came. They would tell the truth, not immediately and not without careful planning, but they would acknowledge what had been done. Eleanor would be restored to the family records. The hidden chamber would become a memorial. Her story would be shared, not as a scandal to be ashamed of, but as a reminder that justice matters more than comfort, that truth matters more than reputation. As Elise walked out of that meeting room, she felt something shift in the air of the palace itself, as if the old walls had been holding their breath for over 100 years and could finally exhale. Eleanor's portrait would hang openly now, her name would be spoken, her fight for justice would be remembered.